I want you to just imagine something for a second. Try to put yourself in this specific scenario.
Okay.
You are born into a world that is already completely, just unyieldingly consumed by war.
Right.
You grow up with that war as the constant background noise of your entire life. You reach adulthood. You have children of your own. You raise them in the shadow of that exact same conflict.
Yeah.
And eventually you grow old and die. And all of this happens before that war ever actually ends.
I mean, it sounds like the premise of a dystopian science fiction novel, honestly. Like a society permanently mobilized, where peace is just this, theoretical concept nobody alive actually remembers.
Exactly. It feels entirely like fiction, but it isn't. We are describing the literal day-to-day reality of the 100 Years' War.
Right.
This was the defining conflict between England and France, running from 1337 all the way to 1453.
A conflict that, if we are doing the math here, lasted for 116 years, which is it's staggering.
Yeah.
And that duration fundamentally changes how we need to understand the event.
Because you can't sustain a war for a century based on a single fit of anger.
Exactly. Or a single diplomatic insult. It just doesn't work that way.
Right. And that brings us to the mission of our deep dive today. We are taking the massive stack of sources, articles, and historical notes you've shared with us, and we are going to meticulously strip away the cinematic medieval fantasy version of this conflict.
Oh, yeah, we really need to take off the shining armor for this one.
Definitely. We are pushing past those romanticized tales of continuous, glorious charges on horseback and, chivalrous knights.
Because the reality on the ground was far more complex, far more brutal, and frankly, much more relevant to the systems we operate in today.
Yes. We are going to look at this 116-year meat grinder through a completely different lens. Not as a simple, heroic tale of rival kings, but as a massive, multi-generational systems failure.
Right.
And ultimately, as a brutal systems reboot.
What really stands out when you look at the underlying mechanics of the 14th and 15th centuries is that you see structural issues that still plague modern organizations today.
Oh, absolutely.
We are talking about incredibly tangled, overlapping hierarchies. We are looking at fragile, overextended supply chains. And most critically, we see a complete lack of dispute resolution mechanisms.
Which is terrifying.
It is. And those systemic flaws literally tore a continent apart.
And the side that eventually won this century-long slog didn't do it just by being physically stronger, right? Or having the biggest sword.
No, not at all. They won by building a more sustainable administrative system.
So for you listening to this, whether you are managing a massive corporate team or studying organizational behavior, or you are just endlessly fascinated by how complex structures inevitably collapse under their own weight and then recover.
Which happens constantly.
Yeah, right. This deep dive is going to completely reframe how you look at human conflict.
It serves as a profound case study in structural tension, for sure.
So let's unpack the broken machine. We need to look at the structural causes first. Usually, when you read a standard history textbook about the start of the 100 Years' War, it points directly to the year 1337.
Right, 1337.
That is when Philip VI of France confiscated the incredibly wealthy territory of Aquitaine from England's King Edward III.
Textbooks love a clean starting line, They point to that confiscation as if someone simply flipped a switch and started the war.
But the sources we have make it explicitly clear that the confiscation of Aquitaine was merely the trigger.
Yeah, exactly.
It was a spark in a room that was already filled to the ceiling with gas. The geopolitical system of Western Europe was primed to explode due to massive, entirely unresolved structural contradictions.
Yeah, and if we drill down into the mechanics of that, we have to examine the deeply flawed nature of feudalism at that specific moment in time.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Let's look closely at the situation with Aquitaine. You have the King of England holding vast, economically vital lands situated entirely within the borders of France. Because of the strict rules of how feudalism operated, this created an impossible paradox. The King of England was, simultaneously, a completely independent sovereign monarch in his own right, and a subordinate vassal to the French king for those specific continental lands.
I was trying to map this onto something we deal with today, and it is just a fundamentally broken organizational structure.
Oh, completely.
Imagine a corporate org chart where the CEO of Company A is somehow also a middle manager at Company B.
Right.
And they are required to report to Company B's CEO. But to make it even more absurd, Company B's CEO is technically their primary market rival.
That's a great way to put it.
That is not a functional chain of command. That is an infinite loop. And infinite loops in any system, whether it is software architecture, corporate governance, or medieval statecraft, are going to create a crash.
That analogy holds up perfectly when you look at the friction it caused. You cannot have overlapping hierarchies without eventual catastrophic friction.
That just doesn't work.
Right. Because as a vassal for Aquitaine, the English king was supposed to pay homage to the French king.
Which means what, practically?
That meant literally kneeling before a rival monarch and swearing fealty. It also meant that if a local lord in Aquitaine had a legal dispute with the English king, that lord could appeal over the English king's head directly to the French court in Paris.
Wait, which completely undermines the English king's authority in his own territory.
Precisely the point. The French kings weaponized that legal loophole constantly to undermine English control.
Wow.
You simply cannot be an independent authority and a subservient vassal at the same time without the entire diplomatic system buckling under the paradox.
Right, it's just unsustainable.
But that feudal contradiction was only one of the major pressure points. We also have to fold in a catastrophic succession crisis.
The sudden collapse of the Capetian dynasty in France.
Yeah. The Capetians had enjoyed what historians sometimes call a genetic miracle.
A genetic miracle.
Basically, yeah. For over 300 years, from the late 900s to the early 1300s, they had a continuous, unbroken line of eldest sons inheriting the throne.
Oh, wow. That's a long time.
It creates immense stability. Everyone knows exactly how the system works and who is in charge. But suddenly, in the early 14th century, that line breaks. The French king dies without a clear, direct male heir.
And nature abhors a vacuum, right?
Exactly. Multiple claimants step forward, waving their family trees, arguing they have the most plausible legitimacy.
Right.
And one of those claimants happens to be England's King Edward III, who actually had a remarkably strong direct claim through his mother, Isabella of France.
And I imagine the French were not exactly thrilled about that.
No, they weren't.
Mm.
In response to an English king suddenly demanding the French crown, the French nobility panic. They dig into the archives and suddenly invoke something called Salic law.
Okay, what is Salic law?
This was an ancient, obscure Frankish code, which they interpreted to mean that royal inheritance absolutely cannot pass through the female line.
How convenient.
Very convenient. They used this to explicitly block Edward's claim and crown a different, purely French cousin instead, Philip VI.
Now, the notes emphasize that we have to look at this impartially to understand the psychology of the war.
Right, we're not picking sides here.
Because from their own perspectives, both factions felt entirely legally justified. To the English, their legal claim was absolutely sound based on the standard inheritance norms that operated across most of Europe at the time. A grandson inheriting through a mother was completely normal.
Yes. But to the French establishment, invoking Salic law wasn't just some neutral, objective exercise in legal scholarship. It was an existential, strategic maneuver for political survival.
They just didn't want an English king.
Exactly. The French aristocracy could not fathom the idea of being ruled from London by a foreign monarch who spoke a different dialect and had entirely different cultural loyalties.
And, I mean, when you suddenly rewrite the rules or conveniently unearth an ancient technicality during a massive crisis, the perceived legitimacy of your entire system is instantly compromised. The English view the French as thieves stealing a crown,
Right.
and the French view the English as foreign usurpers trying to exploit a loophole. So you have a combustible scenario where both sides firmly believe, down to their marrow, that they possess absolute legitimacy. The shared rulebook of medieval diplomacy essentially burned to the ground.
It really did. And on top of the infinite loop of feudal authority and the sudden breakdown of succession rules, we have to add a third structural failure.
Which is?
Massive economic choke points. The source material specifically highlights the region of Flanders, which corresponds roughly to parts of modern-day Belgium and northern France.
The epicenter of the medieval cloth trade.
Yes.
Because this conflict wasn't merely about fancy crowns and aristocratic pride. This was about cold, hard revenue streams.
Always follow the money, right? Flanders was the industrial powerhouse of the 14th century. It had a massive weaving industry, but that industry was entirely dependent on importing raw English wool.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, England was essentially the Saudi Arabia of wool at the time. They controlled the vital supply of raw materials. However, politically and geographically, the Count of Flanders was a vassal to the King of France.
It is a textbook choke point. You have extreme economic interdependence clashing directly with political borders.
Exactly.
England wants the massive export revenue from selling the wool. France wants the massive tax revenue from the finished cloth. And Flanders is just caught in a vice, needing English sheep to survive, but answering to French tax collectors.
So combine those three elements. Economic friction over vital supply chains, an unresolved succession crisis with no shared legal framework, and an infinite loop of overlapping feudal authority.
It's a disaster waiting to happen.
You are looking at a geopolitical system that has zero capacity left to absorb tension. There was no international HR department to step in.
Right.
There was no shared arbitration court. And crucially, neither the English nor the French leadership could simply de-escalate, negotiate, or back down without appearing incredibly weak to their own people.
Because if a medieval king backs down from a legitimate claim, the powerful nobles in his own court just smell blood in the water.
Exactly. Showing weakness internally was often more dangerous than going to war externally.
Which means peace actually offered a lower political payoff than a war.
Yep. Once a system reaches that state, peace becomes unstable and conflict becomes structurally reinforced. Every single rational choice made by these leaders to preserve their own internal power simply pushed the broken system further toward total systemic collapse.
Wow.
War became the only remaining output the system could produce.
Okay, so let's shift from why the machine broke to how it actually functioned once it started tearing itself apart. We need to walk through the 4 distinct phases of this conflict because it completely shatters the first major myth most people have.
Right.
This was not 116 years of continuous daily fighting.
No, it wasn't. It was highly iterative. The timeline behaves exactly like a massive failing operating system going through repeated forced reboots.
I love that analogy.
You see a cycle: rapid mobilization, a violent breakthrough, total logistical exhaustion, a period of adaptation, and then renewed conflict a decade later.
And walking through these phases perfectly illustrates the vital difference between securing a tactical win and achieving strategic success.
Absolutely.
So the first phase is characterized by sheer English dominance, running roughly from 1337 to 1360. This is the era that produced the famous battles you might have actually heard of, like the Battle of Crecy in 1346 and the Battle of Poitiers in 1356.
Right.
And the defining feature of this phase is the stark, violent contrast between the two military paradigms.
Yeah, we are witnessing a fundamental clash of systems here. France was completely relying on an outdated legacy model. The heavy cavalry.
The classic knights.
Exactly, the fully armored knight charging on a massive war horse to win individual glory. It was a deeply ego-driven aristocratic approach to warfare.
Because the French nobility viewed war as a display of social status and personal valor, right?
Exactly. It was all about chivalry and looking heroic. England, conversely, arrived with a military optimized for brutal, mechanical efficiency and adaptability.
They brought the English longbow.
The longbow completely inverted the battlefield hierarchy. It had a remarkably high rate of fire. A skilled archer could loose up to 10 or 12 arrows a minute, compared to a French crossbowman who might manage 1 or 2.
That's a massive difference.
It's huge. It possessed terrifying armor-penetrating power at range, and crucially, it required years of intense, skeletal-altering practice by disciplined, non-noble commoners.
Right. So at a battle like Crecy, you see the devastating psychological shock when traditional elite aristocratic warfare completely shatters against disciplined ranged units.
Yeah, the French knights charged repeatedly into storms of arrows and were systematically slaughtered by peasants they considered socially beneath them.
Tactical superiority absolutely demolished structural weakness.
Exactly.
But I keep getting stuck on this one glaring question as I read the timeline.
Okay, what is it?
If England had the medieval equivalent of a tactical superweapon with the longbow, and they were utterly dominating the French heavy cavalry in all these famous decisive battles, why on earth didn't they just win the war?
That's the million-dollar question.
Why didn't the conflict permanently end in 1360?
That question cuts to a core law of systems analysis, which is that tactical wins on a battlefield do not equal strategic success in a war.
Right.
England was winning military engagements significantly faster than they were building durable administrative control.
Okay, that makes sense.
It is one thing to march an army into a field and destroy the enemy's military capacity. It is an entirely different, vastly more complex undertaking to build an administrative bureaucracy that can tax, govern, and physically hold a hostile foreign-speaking region.
So they optimized entirely for short-term battlefield dominance.
Yes.
But they failed to integrate the territories they were supposedly conquering.
Exactly. which perfectly sets up the second phase, French recovery lasting from 1360 to 1415. The French leadership essentially undergoes a harsh reality check. They realize that charging massive, expensive knights into a concentrated storm of armor-piercing arrows is a failing strategy.
They realize they have to stop feeding their egos and start fixing the system.
Right. It represents a profound strategic pivot.
Yeah.
The French commanders, notably under leaders like Bertrand du Guesclin, stopped trying to win the war quickly in a single afternoon.
What do they do instead?
They transition entirely to disciplined attrition. They actively avoid large, pitched battles with the English.
Which had to be incredibly difficult to enforce. I mean, you are dealing with medieval lords whose entire political standing, land ownership, and personal identity are tied to battlefield valor.
Oh, the pushback must have been insane.
Right. Telling a French duke to just hide behind a castle wall while the English parade through his fields must have caused massive internal friction.
It required immense discipline, but it worked. Instead of risking everything on the field, the French focused on slow, grinding, incremental recovery. They used sieges, they harassed supply lines, they essentially starved the English out of the territories they couldn't afford to garrison properly.
Because the English system was designed for field victories, not prolonged occupation.
Exactly. So under the pressure of attrition, the English footprint in France steadily shrank.
But then the system fractures again. We enter the third phase, English resurgence, from roughly 1415 to 1429.
Yes.
This is where King Henry V of England steps onto the stage, leading to the famous Battle of Agincourt. Now, the cinematic Shakespearean version tells us Henry was just an unmatched tactical genius who delivered a great speech and inspired his vastly outnumbered men to an impossible, miraculous victory.
Right, the Band of Brothers narrative. And Henry V was certainly a highly capable, ruthless commander. However, if we evaluate the structural reality of the era, England's massive sudden success in this phase relied incredibly heavily on the fact that the French system was internally tearing itself apart.
Wait, what was happening in France?
France wasn't just fighting an external English invasion. France was in the middle of a brutal, bloody civil war between rival aristocratic factions.
Oh, wow. So Henry basically walked through an open front door while the French were too busy burning down their own living room to stop him.
That is exactly what happened. External threats only achieve that level of runaway success when the internal systems of the defender are deeply fractured. Agincourt was a disaster for France, and it magnified English opportunities, allowing them to seize massive swaths of northern France, including Paris.
But it still didn't solve England's core underlying bug, right?
No, it didn't.
How do you sustainably govern millions of French citizens who hate you using an overextended island economy?
You can't. Which initiates the final system reboot. The fourth phase, French consolidation, from 1429 until the end of the war in 1453.
Okay, this is where Joan of Arc enters the narrative.
Yes. And we will dive deep into her specific psychological impact in a moment. But fundamentally, she acts as a massive, sudden, unifying catalyst. France stops bickering. They don't just get inspired, they get organized.
Okay, so they actually start fixing the structure.
The final phase is characterized by state building. The French monarchy centralizes its royal authority, stripping power away from unreliable regional lords. They begin building a more professional, salaried, standing military structure, moving away from relying on the loose, highly conditional obligations of feudalism.
And critically, they begin deploying gunpowder artillery effectively.
Yes. The introduction of cannons changes the entire math of the war.
Because cannons render the old, impregnable stone castles and English strongholds obsolete.
Right. A siege that used to take 8 months of starvation could now be resolved in a matter of weeks through concentrated artillery fire.
That's a paradigm shift.
Meanwhile, England is hopelessly overextended. They lack sustainable control mechanisms, the domestic treasury runs dry, and the entire English continental operation collapses inward. The Battle of Castillon in 1453, where French artillery decimated an English force, marks the functional end of the war. France regains almost every inch of territory except for the port of Calais.
When you zoom out and look at the grand arc of those 4 phases, the lesson is incredibly stark. France didn't eventually win this century-long nightmare because they magically became stronger or because they found a better tactical superweapon to counter the longbow.
Right.
They won because they learned, they adapted structurally, and they rebuilt their society for long-term administrative sustainability. Over time, in any sufficiently long conflict, structural sustainability will always outlast short-term tactical optimization.
It is absolutely a lesson in the limits of military power divorced from administrative capacity.
That is a fascinating high-level view. But up until now, we have been analyzing the timeline from 10,000 feet. We're talking about the kings, the grand strategies, the shifting borders on a map. I want to bring this narrative violently down to the ground.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's look at the invisible front line. How did this 116-year system failure actually feel, physically and psychologically, for the human beings trapped inside it?
We have to strip away the romantic abstraction entirely here. The sensory reality of the Hundred Years' War was not trumpets sounding across a sunlit meadow while banners fluttered in the breeze.
Right.
If you were physically present in this system, the dominant visual tone was gray skies, churned, wet earth, endless mud, and the constant ominous smear of smoke on the horizon. Armor wasn't shining. It was dulled, scratched, and plagued by constant rain and rust.
And even the pacing of the violence was completely different than we imagine. It wasn't constant daily sword fights.
No, not at all. The sonic texture of this war was mostly the wind across empty, ruined fields, the distant sound of marching boots, and incredibly long, agonizing periods of sheer boredom and silence.
Boredom.
Yeah, that silence was only occasionally punctuated by brief, chaotic bursts of terrifying, intimate violence. Pitched battles involving thousands of men were actually quite rare events.
So the grueling attritional siege was the default state of military operations.
Exactly. A siege meant months of sitting in freezing mud outside the high stone walls of a castle or a fortified town. It meant waiting for the people inside to run out of rats to eat. It meant rampant dysentery and disease tearing through the besieging army camp. The primary weapon wasn't the sword, it was starvation.
And when those armies were actively on the move, the reality was even more brutal. The sources detail England's signature operational tactic throughout much of the war, which was called the chevauchée. I want to make sure we understand exactly what this entailed. This wasn't an army marching out to find the French military to engage in honorable combat. This was deliberate, calculated, scorched earth raiding.
Yes. Fast-moving English-mounted units would deliberately bypass fortified targets and ride aggressively through the unprotected agricultural French countryside. Their explicit codified mission was to burn the wheat fields, slaughter the livestock, torch the peasant villages, and destroy the mills and ovens that processed food.
Reading the notes on the chevauchée, it instantly made me think of a modern cyber attack.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
It functions exactly like a distributed denial of service, a DDoS attack, but applied to a physical, medieval economy. The English aren't trying to hack the French military's mainframe by fighting their knights. They are just systematically crashing the agricultural servers that keep the entire French society fed, funded, and functioning.
That's a brilliant way to phrase it. The purpose was entirely economic and psychological. You destroy the opponent's ability to sustain their society. If you burn a region's mills and crops, you immediately hollow out the French king's tax base in that region.
Right, no crops, no taxes.
And if the French king cannot collect taxes, he cannot afford to pay soldiers to protect the region. And psychologically, you demonstrate to the French peasantry that their king is completely powerless to defend them, thereby destroying his internal legitimacy.
It highlights a mechanical reality of history that is rarely discussed.
Yeah?
Logistics dictate movement, not glory. Armies in the 14th century didn't move based on grand, sweeping, strategic maps drawn in a war room.
No, they moved based on the harvest cycle. They moved based on weather windows.
Right.
An army of 10,000 men and horses consumes an unbelievable tonnage of food and clean water every single day. If your supply system is weak, your brilliant battlefield strategy is completely irrelevant because your men will starve to death on the march before they ever see the enemy. The chevauchée understood that. It was warfare aimed at the supply chain.
Which creates this massive, heartbreaking divide in how the war was actually experienced, depending entirely on where you sat in the hierarchy.
Yeah, the disconnect is huge.
You have the ordinary soldiers. They aren't fighting for grand ideological concepts of the French nation or the English crown. They are driven by exhaustion, the threat of punishment, and a deep survival-based loyalty to their local unit, the guy standing next to them in the shield wall.
Exactly. And beneath them you have the civilians, the invisible front line.
They are the ones absorbing the true physical cost of this massive system's failure. Their thatched homes are the ones being torched in the chevauchée. Their winter grain is being forcibly confiscated by whichever army happens to be marching past that week, regardless of whether that army speaks English or French.
Right.
For the civilians, the goal isn't geopolitical victory. The goal is securing enough calories to survive the winter.
And contrast that lived reality with the leaders, the kings, the dukes, the high-ranking nobility. They are operating in palaces, dealing with incredibly delayed information, far removed from the physical violence,
Hmm.
the dysentery, and the starvation.
They're completely insulated.
They are playing a high-stakes, abstract game of legitimacy, marriages, and geopolitical alliances.
The gap between those leaders who are obsessively pursuing their political legitimacy and ego and the ordinary people who are bleeding and starving to fund that pursuit, that gap is terrifying.
It really is.
Because that gap of insulated privilege is exactly where broken systems manage to persist for decades longer than they naturally should. If the kings and the dukes had been forced to freeze and starve in the mud outside a castle, the Hundred Years' War would not have lasted 116 years. It would have lasted about 6 months.
I completely agree. The people driving the war and the people physically experiencing the war are operating in entirely different realities. And that disconnect leads us directly to the concept of internal fractures.
Right.
Because the suffering of the French populace wasn't just caused by English armies burning their fields. We have to completely dismantle the persistent myth that this was a clean, two-sided England versus France narrative.
Yeah, this part of the historical record is wildly chaotic. The political front lines were a total mess of shifting allegiances. Let's dig into the internal French Civil War that was actively raging during the Hundred Years' War.
It's a crucial piece of the puzzle.
We have two main, violently opposed factions within France, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs.
Yes. Understanding the motivations of these two factions is the absolute key to understanding why the system remained unstable for so long.
Okay, let's break them down.
The Burgundians, led by incredibly wealthy and ambitious figures like the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, were primarily focused on securing regional power and autonomy. The Duchy of Burgundy was effectively an independent state in everything but name.
So they didn't really care about the broader French crown.
They wanted significant controlling influence over it, sure, but they firmly believed that maintaining their own regional economic order mattered far more than showing unity under a weak, central French king.
And because of that intense focus on regional autonomy, the Burgundian faction would sometimes actively align themselves, militarily and politically, with the invading English armies.
It seems counterintuitive to a modern observer, but yes, they did.
I have to pause on that because trying to follow this logic requires a total mindset shift. The French are fighting a desperate war for survival against the English. But the French are also engaged in a bloody civil war against other Frenchmen. And sometimes, a powerful faction of the French is actively teaming up with the invading English to kill the other French faction. How did anyone at the time even keep track of who the good guys were?
That is exactly the shift in perspective we need to make. There are no clean alignments of good or evil national patriots here. If you look for moral absolutes, the entire system makes no logical sense.
Yeah, it just looks like chaos.
But if you look at their immediate political incentives, it makes perfect sense. Every single player is acting entirely rationally within their specific constraints to preserve their own local power.
So to a leader like John the Fearless, signing a treaty with England wasn't some comic book villain betrayal of his homeland. It was just a cold strategic calculation.
Exactly. For the Burgundians, adapting to whoever offered the best regional advantage, whether that was a weak French king they could control or a strong English king they could partner with, was the logical, necessary move to protect their own borders.
Makes sense from their perspective.
Now contrast their localized mindset with their bitter rivals, the Armagnacs. Their core motivation was the exact opposite. They demanded absolute, centralized royal authority. They wanted a unified France under the strict control of the legitimate French king.
And they were willing to fight for it.
They were entirely willing to wage a brutal war against the Burgundians to eliminate that regional fragmentation, even while English armies were literally marching toward Paris.
Let me map this back onto a corporate analogy. It is the ultimate toxic workplace scenario. The company is currently being subjected to an incredibly aggressive, hostile takeover by a massive rival firm. But instead of banding together to fight off the takeover, the board of directors is locked in a boardroom, violently suing each other for control of the sinking ship, and one of the directors keeps unlocking the front door for the rival firm's lawyers.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. And this brings us to a vital, universal principle of systems analysis. You rarely lose solely because your external enemy is overwhelmingly strong. You lose because your own internal system is fundamentally divided.
That's a great point.
Let's look back at Henry V at the Battle of Agincourt. We treat it as this unmatched, glorious external victory for England. But the reality is that Henry's success was massively subsidized by the internal disorder of the French opponent.
Because of the Burgundian-Armagnac split.
Yes. The bitter, violent tension between those two factions created the massive structural fracture that England simply drove a wedge into. A unified system can absorb massive external shocks, but a fractured system shatters at the first hard blow.
That structural reality makes perfect sense. So we have covered the physical reality of the mud, the logistics, and the scorched earth. We have covered the chaotic internal political backstabbing. Now, I want to pivot to the invisible architecture that actually governed all of this.
Okay.
Let's look at information, narrative, and the profound power of legitimacy. Because how information moved and how it was deliberately twisted by the people in power controlled the momentum of this war for over a century.
What is genuinely fascinating about this era is the sheer, terrifying instability of truth.
The instability of truth. What do you mean?
In the 14th and 15th centuries, the information ecosystem is agonizingly, dangerously slow. You have messengers riding on horseback through muddy, bandit-filled roads. You have delayed, handwritten letters. You have proclamations shouted in town squares. And you have a massive, society-wide reliance on unverified rumor.
There is no live satellite feed of the battlefield. There is no instant messaging. Commanders are making literal life-or-death strategic decisions based on data that might be 3 weeks stale by the time it reaches their tent.
Exactly. Which means no single person inside the war has an objective, top-down overview of what is actually happening. Everyone lives inside isolated fragments of reality.
That sounds like a nightmare for strategy.
It is. And because objective truth is so unstable and difficult to verify, information is constantly actively molded to serve power and maintain morale. Misinformation wasn't a glitch in the medieval system. It was a core feature of the wartime environment.
The sources outline this brilliant concept of contested realities. A battle wasn't just a physical event where thousands of men clashed in a field. It was a narrative event that had to be interpreted.
Exactly.
If the English win a skirmish in a muddy field, the English leadership immediately sends out letters framing it as undeniable, objective proof of their divine right to the French throne. God has literally weighed in on the real estate dispute and chosen them.
But to the French leadership in Paris, that exact same battle is framed entirely differently. It is broadcast as a temporary minor setback. It is a test of faith from God, or perhaps the result of a specific cowardly betrayal by a local lord.
We just spin it.
Completely. The facts of the battle are ignored in favor of the narrative utility, and to the civilians living near the battlefield. That same battle just means a new wave of heavily armed, hungry men are about to requisition their entire winter grain supply.
Right.
It is the exact same physical event, but the meaning is entirely contested based on where you sit in the system and what you need the truth to be.
So morale, and therefore the willingness of the populace to keep paying taxes for the war, depends entirely on which interpretation of reality you believe.
Yes.
Which is the perfect, necessary entry point to talk about Joan of Arc. Because usually in pop culture, she is portrayed as this solitary, almost magical, sword-wielding warrior who just shows up out of nowhere, fights a few battles, and magically wins the war.
Yeah, the movies really lean into that angle.
But the historical material reframes her completely. She wasn't just a brilliant military tactician. She functioned as a massive legitimacy catalyst.
Legitimacy catalyst is the exact right terminology to understand her systemic function. Joan of Arc provided a massive, unprecedented lightning strike shift in morale.
Because she didn't instantly invent better cannons.
Yeah, of course not. She didn't magically fix the broken, overextended supply chains overnight either.
Yeah.
What she did was entirely reframe the narrative architecture of the war. She presented the grueling, cynical French resistance not just as a miserable political struggle for territory between greedy cousins, but as a divinely sanctioned holy imperative.
Let's view this through a modern organizational lens. It is exactly like when a massive, dying legacy tech company brings in a wildly visionary new CEO.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
The new leader doesn't magically sit down and fix the millions of lines of bloated, broken code base on day one. They don't instantly solve the shipping logistics, but they restore belief. They completely rewrite the corporate narrative.
Right.
They make the exhausted, cynical employees actually believe the company has a valid future. And that sudden injection of belief gives the massive corporate system the forward momentum it desperately needs to actually do the hard, unglamorous work of reorganizing the code base and fixing the logistics.
That analogy translates perfectly to the mechanics of statecraft.
Yeah.
Legitimacy is just as important, if not more important, than raw military power.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. Without legitimacy, royal authority erodes. If authority erodes, tax collection completely fails. If taxes fail, the army starves. Joan stabilized the belief of the French people and the fractured military leadership.
She gave them a reason to keep fighting.
And by stabilizing that belief, she bought the battered French state the vital time and the social cohesion it needed for its structural recovery. The administrative centralization, the deployment of professional armies, the gunpowder artillery, to actually take root and eventually push the English out. She forcibly aligned the moral system of the peasantry with the military system of the state.
It is genuinely incredible how a sudden shift in narrative can physically alter the outcome of a century of entrenched violence.
It really is.
So, we are reaching the end of the timeline now. Let's evaluate the aftermath and the ultimate trade-off. We need to look at what this unimaginable, century-long expenditure of blood, wealth, and human energy actually produced when the dust finally settled in 1453.
Well, if we look purely at the immediate territorial and political shifts, it is a near-total reversal of how the conflict began. By 1453, England has been violently ejected from the continent. They have lost almost all of their vast ancestral territories, save for a tiny, isolated commercial foothold in the port of Calais. The grand, multi-generational dream of a dual monarchy, an English king wearing the French crown, is completely dead.
And what about France?
France, meanwhile, has survived the crucible, but it has been fundamentally permanently changed. It has heavily, ruthlessly centralized its royal authority. The chaotic, decentralized, independent feudal model of rival dukes is giving way to a highly recognizable modern state structure.
And there is a massive continent-wide identity shift, too. This conflict started as a technical, dynastic dispute between aristocratic cousins arguing over a feudal throne. But after a century of shared hardship, endless propaganda, and xenophobia, it accidentally forged the early raw versions of nationalism.
It is one of history's greatest unintended consequences. The sheer length and brutality of the conflict hardened the cultural boundaries. It literally made the people living on the island feel more distinctly English, and the people on the continent feel more distinctly French. They began to define themselves in opposition to the enemy. The populations began to see themselves as part of a shared national identity, rather than just isolated subjects of whatever local lord happened to own the valley they lived in.
The military shift is equally massive and permanent. The Romantic era of the Shining Knight, the chivalric code, and aristocratic bravery is dead and buried in the mud of Agincourt and Castile.
Oh, my God.
It has been entirely replaced by the brutal, cold, mathematical logic of state administration, gunpowder, cannons, and logistics. It was the birth of the modern military-industrial complex taking its first, raw form.
Exactly. War stopped being a seasonal hobby for bored aristocrats and became heavily professionalized. And when you have a professional standing army equipped with expensive gunpowder artillery, that requires a massive permanent bureaucracy to constantly tax the civilian population to pay for it all.
Which brings up what I consider the most tragic part of this entire deep dive: the unfathomable opportunity costs.
Oh, the opportunity cost is staggering.
Think about what was not built during those 116 years. All of that human energy, all of that extracted material wealth, all of those burned harvests, entirely consumed by the furnace of a systemic failure.
Yeah.
That wealth could have gone into infrastructure, agricultural innovation, trade networks, art, universities, or local prosperity. Instead, multiple generations spent their entire lives just trying to survive scorched earth raids and crushing war taxes.
It really forces us to ask the ultimate uncomfortable question about the nature of conflict.
It does. So, looking objectively at that horrific multi-generational human cost versus the eventual centralized political gains, who actually won this thing, and was it worth it?
The verdict requires absolute nuance. In conventional, high-level political terms, the state of France won. They retained their sovereign borders and centralized their state power.
But if you ask who actually benefited on a human level...
Exactly. The states themselves learned administratively. They built incredibly durable, tax-extracting bureaucracies that could survive future shocks. But the populations, the millions of ordinary people trapped inside the system, they paid materially with their homes, their livelihoods, and their lives. They did not benefit.
The overarching system evolved and upgraded, but it did so entirely by consuming the people trapped inside of it.
War often successfully resolves an immediate technical dispute like who legally gets to sit on a wooden throne in Paris. But in doing so, It deepens and entrenches the permanent infrastructure for future, even larger wars.
That's a grim thought.
It creates the permanent taxation systems, the standing professional armies, and the mass, deeply ingrained national narratives of rivalry. History has a terrible, persistent habit of heavily praising the complex systems that survive, while entirely forgetting what those systems aggressively consume to become survivable.
History praises the systems that survive while forgetting what they consumed. That phrase is going to stick with me for a long time.
It's the reality of it.
Let's bring this massive journey home. We have traced this failure all the way from the infinite loops of overlapping feudal hierarchies, through the economic choke points of the Flemish wool trade, all the way down into the freezing mud and the scorched earth of the chevauchée.
We have examined how intense internal factionalism and boardroom rivalries can doom a nation, and how a sudden shift in narrative, a catalyst like Joan of Arc, can reboot a collapsing structure and forge a centralized, highly taxed nation-state out of the ashes.
It has been an unbelievable ride through the mechanics of a century-long collapse, and I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering thought to mull over as you go about your week. Take a hard look at our modern world. Look at our sprawling international alliances, our massive, tangled corporate structures, or even the highly complex digital and supply chain networks we rely on for our daily survival.
And ask yourself where the cracks are.
Exactly. Where do we currently have our own overlapping hierarchies? Where are our unresolved structural contradictions masking deep internal instability?
Because while the technology changes, the underlying mechanics of how complex systems collapse haven't changed in the slightest.
Where are our modern systems just sitting there, drenched in gasoline, waiting for a single spark over a seemingly minor dispute? And when they inevitably begin to break down, will the people in charge try to optimize for a quick, ego-driven short-term win? Or will they do the painful, unglamorous work of adapting for a long-term survival? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of history.
It has been an absolute pleasure pulling these systems apart with you.
Remember that image we started with: to be born, to grow old, and to die, all within the exact same span of a single, unresolved systemic failure. It forces you to realize just how incredibly fragile our own modern systems truly are, and exactly how much we owe to the quiet, daily maintenance that keeps them from finally breaking apart. Until next time.